Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me here and for coming. It's great to be at the John Locke Foundation, which is really a wonderful model for those of us who are eager to see good ideas turned into public policy in our national life. To my mind, the state level is where government really happens in the United States. It's where it really belongs on a lot of key issues, and institutions like this really help us to see how we ought to be governing ourselves, and John Locke Foundation is a great model of how that ought to work. So thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I've worked with John Locke Foundation people in the past and have not had a chance to visit, so I'm very glad to do it. There's a lot we could talk about. We could talk about the state of our politics. We could talk about Trump or Congress and the courts and the economy, and I'm happy to chat about all of that. And in fact, I will raise all of that in one way or another in this brief talk here. But coming to speak before an institution that is doing such important work, I thought that I would talk about the state of our institutions a little bit, and what it has to do with all of those other things, with politics and with culture and with our larger society. In a sense, Americans are living through a social crisis now. In some respects, the last election reflected that. It was a response to it. A public and voter response to some challenges that have been ignored. Our larger culture reflects it. Our popular culture reflects it. In some ways, it feels like a kind of dissolution in American life. I think a lot of people who look at our politics have a sense that this is a moment in which things are dissolving. And in some respects, it feels like a kind of breaking down of society into parts that oppose one another. On the left, they see that in terms of identity politics. We can't help but see it on the right as well, in the ways in which our politics has become polarized, in the ways in which our political conversations have become more heated on almost every subject under the sun. And it's frankly not exactly the case that everybody's yelling at everybody else in our society, but everybody's yelling, at least into the void. I can illustrate that for you in a small way in my own experience on social media. We're on Facebook Live, as you hear, and my life on Facebook is like living on two different planets at the same time. I'm on the one hand, I'm Jewish. I grew up in New Jersey. I live in Maryland now. I have a PhD, so everybody around me is super liberal, not to say just about communist. On the other hand, I'm a conservative, and I work in the conservative world. And so everyone I work with is quite conservative. And so on Facebook, these two groups of people, these two sides of my world, are on completely different planets. And they're not mad at each other, exactly. They're each mad at something that the other is barely even aware of. And they're always mad. And so it's a strange experience to watch this happen. That's one facet of the kind of social breakdown as it presents itself now in our experience. Those of us who are lucky enough not to live with the worst facets of that breakdown, the breakdown of family and of community, the truly debilitating facets of what the country is going through, we see it at least as stark polarization and division. But there is something that the two frustrated ends of our politics actually seem to agree about, and that is that our institutions at some level have been failing us. It's almost a cliche by now to talk about declining faith in institutions in America. We don't trust any of our major institutions. Trust in government as a whole and in its different branches at the national level has been plummeting now for decades and is extremely low. But trust in the professions, in doctors and lawyers and accountants and teachers, is also way down. Trust in university and the academy is way down. Trust in organized religion has crashed in the last few decades. Trust in journalism is in the dumps. Banks and law enforcement and scientists, we've been losing trust in all of them in American life. The numbers are extraordinary. One key social, political, and economic institution after another has lost the confidence of the public. So what's going on here? Why has this happened? We can think about that question through the very broad lens of a kind of social transformation. And I tried to do that in a book I published in 2016 called The Fractured Republic that suggested that Americans have been going through a process of fragmentation that's left each of us kind of going his own way and losing confidence in the things that we do together as a society. I'll be talking a little bit about that in the talk that you heard about this evening. But there's another way of understanding the nature of that problem that might be of particular interest to you here. To take up that other approach, I think it's worth asking what really is an institution, and what does it mean to have faith in institutions or trust in institutions? In the broadest sense, a political scientist or a sociologist or an economist might tell you that institutions are in essence something like the forms of our associational life. Whether it is an actual corporate entity like a school or a business or a legislature, or whether it's a body of rules and practices and norms and behaviors, like we say the institution of marriage or a profession, an institution gives structure to the ways that we live together. Generally speaking, institutions work to accomplish some socially important task, educating the young or making laws or defending the country or helping the poor or producing some good or service. And they work to do it by establishing a structure and a process, a form for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that goal. So in effect, the institution also forms people so as to carry out that task in an effective way and a responsible and reliable way. It creates an ethic that defines how people go about their common work, and in turn that shapes their behavior and even their character in doing that. And that ethic often involves a way of achieving the core goal of the institution, not only effectively, but also in a way that guards against some of the dangers that always follow us into social life as human beings. Dangers like individual selfishness or avarice or ambition, even lust and vice. We value the institution because it carries out that task, but also because it forms people in a way that helps them do it appropriately or properly or ethically. This understanding of the roles of institutions helps us to clarify a little bit what trust in an institution might mean. Our faith in institutions is not just utilitarian. It's not just about how they perform the task they're set up for on the face of it. It's also real trust. We trust an institution because it seems to have an ethic that makes the people within it trustworthy. We trust political institutions when they're shaped to take seriously some obligation to the public interest, and they pursue the work of self-government that way and shape the people inside them to do that. We trust the military because it values courage and honor and duty in carrying out the defense of the country. And again, it forms men and women who do that too. We trust a business because it promises quality and integrity in meeting some need that we have, and it rewards its people as they deliver those. We trust a university if it's shaped and if it shapes the people within it to be devoted to learning and to truth. We trust a journalistic institution because it has high standards of honesty in reporting the news that makes the work of its people reliable. Shaping the people within it this way is one of the core functions of any institution. And so we lose faith in an institution when we don't believe any longer that it plays this kind of ethical or formative role. One way that can happen is just in a very straightforward way, when institutions fail to protect us from avarice or selfishness or vice in the way they carry out their basic purpose. So if a bank cheats its customers, if a member of the clergy abuses a child, we naturally lose some confidence in that institution. But another way is when they fail to impose an ethic on the people within them at all, when they seem to exist only to serve those individuals' interests. And so they don't seem to be worthy of our trust, not so much because they've failed to earn it, but because they're not even really asking for it. And something like that, I think, is what has been happening to some of our institutions in the last few decades, and has to do with why the loss of confidence in American institutions is so broad and widespread. They no longer work as if their purpose is to shape the people inside them to be reliable and responsible and trustworthy. In fact, our very understanding of what institutions are for has changed in some subtle but really fundamental ways in this regard. We've moved, very roughly speaking, from thinking of institutions as molds that shape and form people's characters and habits towards seeing institutions as platforms that allow people to perform before a wider audience. And this subtle, gradual change in our expectations has driven and has magnified our loss of confidence in institutions. When we don't think of our institutions as formative, but rather as performative, when the presidency and Congress are just stages for individual performance art, or when a university becomes a venue for vain virtue signaling, or when journalism is indistinguishable from a megaphone, they become harder to trust. They aren't asking for our trust. They're only asking for our attention. And in our time, a lot of the most significant social and political and cultural and intellectual institutions are in the process of going through this kind of transformation, from mold to platform, from formative to performative. The few exceptions that do exist, most notably the military, which is still unabashedly the most formative institution in American life, actually prove this rule because they also tend to be the few institutions in which we are not losing faith. But the institutions that have tended to become just platform just platforms for performance, are a lot more numerous and they've fared a lot more poorly. It would be strange to trust a platform, and we generally don't. This kind of multi-decade transformation of our sense of the purpose of institutions is evident across a broad range of institutions in our society. As I said, it's at the heart of the crisis of the modern university. It's at the core of what's been happening to journalism. It is the very essence of social media and at the root of a lot of its effects on our social life. But to focus on an example that I've seen close up, in particular myself, I want to talk with you about the effects of this process on our constitutional system and on its institutions, that is, on Congress, on the presidency, and on the courts. The public's faith in all three of those institutions has declined a lot. The courts for a while seemed immune to that trend, but they're certainly not any longer. And that faith has declined for reasons that have to do with exactly this transformation of attitudes and expectations. I'll start with Congress, and really we'll focus mostly on Congress because the Constitution starts with Congress and focuses mostly on Congress. And also because in a lot of ways the institutional decay that's been evident is evident first and foremost in Congress. We're all in the habit now of just kind of glaring at the presidency. Whatever you think of what's going on in the presidency in the Trump years, it's certainly very interesting. But a lot of the problems that we're seeing in our constitutional system are actually focused in Congress and are fundamentally either a function of how Congress has changed or a reaction to how Congress has changed. The legislative branch is not only the first branch in terms of the order of the way the Constitution sets out our government, it's also, in the thinking of the founders, was certainly the first and foremost branch. In fact, if anything, they worried that it would be too strong in the constitutional system. James Madison, in particular, thought that any Republican form of government would always be subject to the excesses of legislative dominance. The legislative branch, he wrote in Federalist 48, would always be, quote, extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. In Federalist 51, Madison lays out this as the reason for the bicameral legislature and for some other important elements of our constitutional system. He writes there, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches. As the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. Now, this strikes our modern ears as kind of bizarre, especially for conservatives. The idea that the legislature would be too strong and the executive would be too weak seems like Madison has his worries inverted. We've been worried for a long time about the rise of the imperial executive, the rise of the administrative state, the rise of presidential power, all at the expense of Congress. And these worries are justified. All of that has happened. But I think that we tend to underplay the degree to which it's happened as the result of willful congressional dereliction and how this has transformed the character of Congress as an institution. Sometimes that dereliction is a very simple matter. Members of Congress just don't want to make hard choices and don't want to bear the responsibility for trade-offs. And so they keep the easy stuff for themselves, and they let the president or sometimes judges make the particularly tough calls. That means passing very vague legislation that sets out generally popular goals and then leaving it to the executive branch to figure out the details and leaving it out to judges to sort out the complicated problems that result from that enormous discretion given to the executive. We can see that pattern in recent years in healthcare and in education and in environmental policy across a wide range of areas. I served in the White House under George W. Bush as a policy staffer, and I can certainly tell you a lot of stories about members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, coming to us and asking the administration to do things that they could easily do and should do, but not wanting to bear the responsibility for making difficult choices. But sometimes that dereliction can be a little bit more complicated and can run deeper toward the core of the institutional confusion of today's Congress. Many members of Congress have come to view the institution as a kind of platform for themselves, as a way to raise their profile, as a way to become celebrities in the world of cable news or talk radio. In essence, to perform. And what's lost in the process is the capacity to legislate, to deliberate, to compromise even. Congress, like any serious institution, functions by socializing its members to work together. But when those members see the institutions as a stage for their individual performances, they don't become socialized to work together. They're left in a kind of antisocial form, each of them trying to shine over the others. And that makes accommodations, even within a political party in Congress, certainly between them, very hard to come by, and it makes legislating very difficult and frankly very rare. What we see now is a Congress that basically passes one law per year, and inevitably it's hard to be happy with that legislation. This is exacerbated even more by a loss of some protected spaces for deliberation in Congress. Every institution needs an inner life, some sanctum where its work is really done. And Congress has progressively lost its inner life. All of its deliberative spaces have become performative spaces over the years. Everything has become televised. There's less and less room and time for talking in private and legislating. That's happened in the name of transparency, and transparency is a good thing. But we've treated it as a good thing without any costs, when in fact it can have some enormous costs. And those have to be at least accounted for in the balance of judgments we make about politics. The result of this is a Congress that increasingly has the appearance of a show and does less and less real bargaining, real legislating. Not none, but less and less. And because that's happened, as one consequence of a broader loss of perspective about the purpose of the institution, even people who recognize that there's a problem, as almost everybody in Congress does now, people who set out to reform the institution don't actually agree about what it is that needs to be reformed, what it is that Congress is even failing to do now. We're very far from the ideal of a Congress that exists to compel accommodation in a vast and diverse country. And getting to that point would mean helping members of Congress see what's wrong, see what's missing, and helping them invest their ambitions in the institution's ambitions, rather than in personal performance and personal prominence. Members of Congress are dissatisfied. They're unhappy with how the institution works. So the opening for institutional reform may well exist, but it would need to start with a revitalized sense of Congress as a discrete and formative institution itself, a sense that could help members see that a stronger Congress is in their personal interest. The absence of that institutional ambition is an enormous problem for the constitutional system and has to be the focus of efforts to strengthen that system. In a way, the same is true of the presidency. And it might seem strange for us to say so, because we're certainly not used to thinking of the executive branch as lacking in ambition. But I do think that it's come to lack a properly constitutional ambition in a way that has a lot to do with the broader problem that I'm talking about, the problem of a performative politics. That's maybe become clearer with the current president in some ways, but it's been a problem for longer than that. It was certainly a major issue in the last presidency, and in some respects has been for decades. A little over a year into Donald Trump's presidency, I think neither the most hopeful nor the most fearful predictions about how it would go have been confirmed, generally speaking. People who dreamed that Trump might be a kind of populist Machiavellian, ingeniously reviving our system of government by breaking through our hackneyed partisan categories, have been disappointed so far. But maybe for that very reason, the people who feared that Trump would usher in an autocracy, as a lot of people have, assaulting our constitutional system, trampling our freedoms, also have been proven wrong. Trump not only couldn't pull off any kind of assault like that, he shows no serious sign of wanting to do that. In fact, excessive hope and excessive fear about what the Trump presidency would bring, I think, have been rooted in a common error, an error that has to do precisely with a way of thinking about what the president wants, and really what any president wants. Both begin from the assumption that Trump ran for president in order to use the presidency to achieve a set of relatively conventional political or policy objectives. And each forms its expectations around some sense of what those might have been. But a year and more into his presidency, it doesn't really look like that was the nature of Trump's ambition. And this is really to step aside from the policy implications of what's happened over this past year, some of which have been good in my view and some of which have not been. But to think about the nature of the president's ambition within the institutional structure of our system. His ambition seems to have been something like a desire to put himself at the center of our national consciousness and attention. And I think something like that could have been said about President Obama as well. In a sense, what he wanted most, and what some of his more peculiar choices and actions are directed toward achieving, is to be at the center of our attention and to be at the center of the action in our national life. Everything else, from policy priorities to political alliances, is always subject to change in pursuit of that goal. And this could also be a key to understanding the effects that he might ultimately have on our constitutional system. To say that Trump thinks of his role in terms of elevating himself in our consciousness, again, maybe just being on our minds all the time, is in some sense to say that he has an oversized ego. But everybody at that level of politics has an oversized ego. That's not the way in which Donald Trump is distinctly different from past presidents. Every president runs to be something, and really, in some ways, maybe to be the most famous person in the world. But they also, of course, run to do something. And President Trump wants to do something too, clearly. But how he understands and pursues that desire might be what makes his particular ambition most distinctive. A politician that seeks high office naturally thinks about how to be something by doing something. That is, how to use his office to advance his aims and therefore also to be popular. The framers of our Constitution understood that ambition would work this way. And for that matter, they really understood how the desire for fame, for renown, would speak powerfully to would-be leaders in our politics. They designed the system to channel that kind of desire for fame in various ways in the service of American self-government. The ambitions of our presidents generally have been routed in this way, driving them to work either through the system as it was conceived or against the system in ways that are highly aware of it, even if they're also very frustrated with its structure. Barack Obama, for instance, routinely exceeded the bounds of presidential power, but he did it by seizing the powers of the legislative branch or by doing more than the system permits of the sorts of things that it would have presidents do. Trump's exertions in office have mostly been of a different sort, I think, altogether. They've generally been neither channeled through the constitutional framework nor directed against it, so that his ambition has barely been shaped at all by the imperatives of constitutionalism in a traditional sense. Every one of our past presidents has been formed by a set of institutions, whether as a senior military officer or much more commonly as an elected official in another office, that have shaped his understanding of how to act and how to act effectively as the head of the executive branch. President Trump is the first American president who has not been shaped by any experience in any such institutions. His life experiences involved running a family business in real estate and then becoming a kind of performer, basically playing the part of a successful real estate developer in American popular culture. He entered politics in some respects as another performance in that role, and he was elevated to the presidency thanks to his enormous success in that performance. These two sets of experiences have shaped his understanding of the presidency. And that means that that understanding is performative to a very unusual degree. He tends to think of the president not exactly in the traditional sense as a constitutional officer in constant tense engagement with others, but as either a sort of general contractor overseeing a vast project or as a tribune performatively amplifying public sentiments. And there is actually something of both of these things in the presidency, as it's supposed to be. It's not completely detached from the job, but it accentuates these roles in ways that are very unusual in our constitutional history. So that the president tends to instinctively treat members of Congress like incompetent subcontractors, as if they work for him and he's just not happy with how they're doing the job. When the system doesn't really put them in that relationship to him, he's always talking about how he's saving the Pentagon money on ships and planes and making good deals. And his sense of the broader functions of the presidency have turned out to be, I think, in a fundamental way performative, almost theatrical. In just about every setting, he's performing for his audience. And that helps explain his obsession with ratings or with audience size, this kind of running commentary on Twitter, which a lot of the time calls for actions that he could actually just order as the president. And his tendency even to kind of comment on his own speeches as he's delivering them. But it explains, more importantly, I think, the intense desire that he has to please the room at every moment, which can sometimes lead to what seem like shifting positions in an unpredictable way. He seems to want different things at different times in front of different audiences, but he actually wants the same thing. He wants to be acclaimed a winner in the performance that he's engaged in at that moment. And again, I want to say this is not unique to Trump, though the degree to which he takes it is certainly greater than we've seen in past presidencies. It's also a way to understand the Obama presidency, and in some respects it's a way to understand the modern presidency in general. But this added degree brings about a kind of change in kind. So that Trump's role in the operation of our system of government over this past year and a quarter or so can be understood in terms of an absence and a presence. and both of which are good and bad. He's left largely unfilled the part that's traditionally played by the president, while he's been playing a different part, a more theatrical part, formed around the peculiar contours of his own experience and personality. And everybody else in the system has to confront the implications of this unusual combination, both the absence of an executive who's eager to work within that system in the traditional way, and the presence of a kind of aggressive performer at the heart of the system, a figure whose excesses are not structurally counterbalanced by other people in the system, because they're not, strictly speaking, excesses of presidential power, but of something else. And that something else is very similar to the problems that we find bedeviling the Congress. It is an excess of a kind of performative idea of what the purpose of politics is in our system. So far, this absence and this presence have mostly resulted in a kind of chaos that's been very hard for everybody else in Washington to think about. There have certainly been some policy achievements over the past year, some good, some bad. I think the tax bill has been a good one. I think some changes on the regulatory front have been good. There have also been missed opportunities and lost opportunities, some of them because of this kind of process. But on the whole, people are still trying to figure out how to find the balance in this system, to figure out just what it is that's going on. And I think an understanding of the excessively performative sense that people in the system have would help us to make sense of what it is that's going on. The appointment of judges could be the one presidential function that doesn't actually require a kind of traditional perseverance. Once they're nominated, they're confirmed by another branch of government, and then they just do their work for the rest of their careers without depending on the president. And so that's been one of the few areas where Republicans really can point to very significant achievements over this year and then some. And beyond that, it's frankly hard to say exactly where they're headed and what kinds of achievements or what kinds of attempts at policy changes we might find. But of course, the appointment of judges points us to the state of the judiciary, where, again, the performative approach to institutions has also been a serious problem. I'll say a little less about this one just in the interest of time, but I would only say that a meaningful portion of the problem that we've tended to describe as judicial activism can also be understood as a form of this broader transformation of attitudes, by which some judges have come to think of the bench as a stage and of their work as fundamentally moralistic performance art. It's less of a competing constitutional theory and more of an alternative idea of the very purpose of the judicial institution. This is not hard to see. You can just read any major opinion by Justice Kennedy, and you'll see exactly what I mean. I'll quote to you from one, a recent one that you'll recognize. He says, quote, "Marriage responds to the universal fear that a lonely person might call out only to find no one there. It offers the hope of companionship and understanding and assurance that while both still live, there will be someone there to care for the other." Now, maybe that's nice, but it's not jurisprudence, right? It isn't really rooted in some alternative theory of the judge or a different idea of the Constitution. It takes the role of the judge as a performer, and it stands up and says, "Look at me." And in a lot of ways, we've found this kind of performance art happening more and more in the judiciary. And again, what we call judicial activism is in some ways this kind of performative judging. The courts have been more resistant to these trends than our other governing institutions so far. They've certainly kept some sanctums for themselves, some spaces that aren't fundamentally performative, some rooms where deliberation is still possible. They do continue to appeal to an ideal of integrity that is fundamentally institutional in character, but they're undeniably moving in the direction of the performative approach to their work, just as Congress is, just as the presidency is. And the trouble with the courts has to be understood, at least in part, as a facet of that larger problem. In our institutions of government, the branches of our constitutional system, this problem, this increasingly performative approach to governing, ends up taking the form of a shortage of appropriate constitutional ambition. We tend to think of it, we on the right in particular, as an excess of ambition. And in some ways, it turns out to be an excess of activity. But I think that it is actually, in the case of all three branches, a shortage of appropriate constitutional ambition. The system is set up to find balance by counterbalancing ambition against ambition. But if different actors in the system are not trying to do their jobs, then they do not counterbalance one another. And the system as a whole falls badly out of whack, so that each of them ends up doing more, being more active than the system would have them do, because they can't be balanced off by the other branches of government. Part of what a recovery would involve is some kind of rekindling of constitutional ambition on all these fronts. But in its larger context, this transformation of our expectations of institutions is a problem that's also powerfully present in many other institutions outside of government. You see it again at the core of the kind of expressive individualism that plays out in our universities, where professors and students are coming to see the institution as a venue in which to be who they are and display who they are, rather than to be transformed by the purpose and structure of higher education. We can see it in journalism, where the institutional structures that are intended to offer some assurances of integrity have broken down into individual celebrity journalists who are each kind of tending to their own brand on Twitter. We see it closer to home, too, in many of the professions and throughout our civic life. To put it this way makes the problem seem awfully daunting and immense. It's bigger than a broken Congress, or bigger than concerns about the president or an activist judiciary. And it is bigger than those things. But putting it this way should also give us some hope that we can each make a dent in this problem where we are. That by recommitting to an ethic of responsible institutionalism, by coming to see that associational life requires forms and structure, and so that it makes sense to invest our pride and energy and ambition in the institutions that we're involved in our own lives, we can start to turn the tide of a kind of social fragmentation and dislocation and dysfunction that have so often now been our lot in American life. What's needed to turn that tide is something that each of us can offer. It means grasping the need for responsibility, for humility. It means working to gain status and build pride within the formal structures of institutions, whichever institutions we might be most invested in. It means giving them our time and our attention, thinking about their health and their vitality. It means pouring ourselves into them as molds and letting them shape us and shape our role in civic life. A revitalization of institutional thinking and institutional action, where we are, near at hand, is essential to a revitalization of our broader civic and social and political life. That kind of revitalization, that renewal, is what's needed now. It's not a simple matter, but it is achievable and it's necessary. And I think that you all here are in a good place to begin, at a state-focused policy institute, at some remove from the polarized dysfunction of Washington, but still very much at the heart of American self-government. You're in a good place to begin by seeing the importance of institutions as formative of character, as channels of responsibility and integrity, as the core basic forms of our social life. A revival of that way of understanding our society could be a crucial step toward the broader American revival that all of us want. And so it can't come soon enough. Thank you very much.